Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Barron-Prahl, and I'm the project manager for the South-Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm honored to be your host for today's webinar, which is Career Development is Everyone's Business, Successfully Integrating Individual Placement and Supported Employment Service and Education Best Practice for Older Youth and Young Adults in your Community Mental Health Center. I want to thank you and our wonderful speakers for being with us here today. Really, I appreciate this. A number of folks are joining from our FEP teams, and this is going to be first off. We want to start with our housekeeping items. Just a couple quick things just so that we can get the lay of the land for today's webinar. First, we've made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, I'll be sure to follow up using your registration information. All attendees are in listen-only mode and cannot share their videos. If you have a question for the presenters, we ask that you go ahead and submit that through our Q&A pod. I'll be monitoring that as well as another colleague, so we'll do our best to respond to your questions as time allows. Also, if you have a comment or want to share a resource with all attendees, please be sure to use the chat box. This event is captioned. To view captions, click the little arrow beside the CC box at the bottom of your screen and choose Show Subtitles. To change the size of the subtitles, just click the arrow next to the CC box and choose Subtitle Settings. And then you'll have an option to be able to make the subtitles larger or smaller. Know that the recording of this presentation will be on our MHTTC website within 2 weeks following the conclusion of this presentation. I'll probably be able to get it up there sooner, but give me a little minute to get it up just in case. And we'll also upload the PowerPoint as well. Know that all attendees can earn 1 continuing education unit after this webinar, and I'll be sure to be emailing you a certificate as well for that within the next 2 weeks. All right. Quick disclaimer, this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I am really pleased to introduce our speakers today. I gotta tell you, they're wonderful people and you're very lucky. We're gonna have a really good conversation today. I wanna start by introducing Dr. Vanessa Kladnick. Vanessa is a nationally recognized expert in adapting and blending evidence-based practices for older youth and young adults, including IPS supported employment. Vanessa is the Director of Research and Innovation for Youth and Young Adult Services at Thresholds, the largest community mental health provider in Illinois, and a faculty affiliate at the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health at the University of Texas at Austin. Vanessa has been involved in multiple projects across the country that enhance IPS and draw from IPS to improve community mental health provider engagement of and partnership with and impact with vulnerable and marginalized young people with serious mental health conditions. Vanessa is currently overseeing the continuous quality improvement of multiple multidisciplinary teams designed for youth and young adults, all of which include supported employment and education specialists. So that is Vanessa. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Ishan Spencer. Ishan believes that work is everyone's business. Ishan Spencer is the Director of Employment and Community Initiatives at Annexer Center. Prior to joining Annexer, Ishan served as the director at Job Corps Joliet, overseeing vocational and residential programming for approximately 250 youth, as well as a director of supported employment at Thresholds. At Thresholds, Ishan saw 11 individual placement and supported employment teams, 2 of which served older youth and young adults. With West Stat and the University of Massachusetts, Ishan co-developed and led implementation of an adaptive version of IPS for young adults in residential care that included supported education and peer mentoring. Ishan consults with multiple states and providers on how to provide high-fidelity IPS to young adults and is a certified IPS fidelity assessor. Ishan is currently completing a counseling psychology internship with Thresholds Mind Strong, a coordinated specialty care team for individuals with recent onset of psychosis. Awesome. I'm happy to have you, Ishan.
Thank you.
And next is Laura. Laura is awesome. Laura is lead clinical trainer in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Sciences Center for Youth Mental Health at the University of Texas at Austin. Laura is responsible for research and dissemination of community mental health best practices for young adults with mental health challenges. Laura is a licensed professional counselor with 8 years of experience in providing evidence-based care in community mental health settings. Laura partners with agencies to integrate innovative strategies for engaging young people in their mental health care. Laura is trained in IPS, the IPS model, and has been involved in multiple projects in Texas to improve IPS integration in community mental health settings for older youth and young adults. Laura is currently leading the development of an online resource and e-learning platform for Texas community mental health care providers who aim to better engage and support youth and young adults through providing services that young people want, which includes employment and education supports. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Glad to have you here.
Hey everyone, welcome. If there's one thing that you take away from today, it is that career development is everyone's business, not just employment, not just education, but career development. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I would like to introduce, we do have a special guest, and thank you, Jennifer. Those were like the most beautiful, I don't think I realized how gorgeous those bios were gonna be or how long, but we have really done a lot in this area, and it's nice to hear all of our accomplishments and everything we've done, really trying to figure out how to enhance IPS for older youth and young adults. But I want to have my colleague Mark, who's sitting next to me, because we're in a post-COVID world, introduce himself. Do you want to say a couple of things about what you bring to this?
Sure, just really quickly. I'm happy to crash the party today. I'm Mark Fagan. I'm a psychologist by trade, and I am Vice President of Clinical Operations at Thresholds in Chicago. And so I oversee all of our youth and young adult services here. And I'm also a trainer in the transition to independence process for youth and young adults as well. And we'll get a chance to talk about that as we move along. So thanks for having me here as well.
Cool. Thanks, Mark. Okay. So today we're going to touch on why IPS is an evidence-based practice. I know a lot of folks on this call are going to be very familiar. We're also going to identify the 8 principles of IPS, but we're going to talk about what they look like specifically for older youth and young adults with serious mental health needs. We're also going to give a lot of really fantastic examples that we hope resonate with you and also inspire you of what IPS looks like on the ground with young adults. And finally, we really hope that you leave with some, I love the term developmentally attuned, but really easy to use strategies that you can bring back to your young people and your colleagues on how to best engage young people in IPS and supported education. All right, Ishan.
Often used interchangeable with supportive employment, individual placement and supportive employment, or IPS, was developed by the Dartmouth Psychiatric Research Center. Now the same team is working with WestStack. It was designed to meet the vocational challenges that people with more psychiatric disorders have traditionally faced when pursuing competitive employment. IPS is an evidence-based employment model that has shown to be the most effective model for helping people with severe mental health challenges obtain and maintain jobs of their choosing. Initially created for adults, IPS has proven to work with other populations and has shown positive results. To date, 28 randomized controlled trials of IPS have been conducted throughout the world, and they all shown a significant advantage for IPS. These studies were conducted by different research investigators in different locations and different labor markets with different populations, and they all found that IPS is more effective than any other employment model, regardless of ethnicity, gender, or social economic status. All studies show that job seekers in IPS obtain employment faster, holds jobs longer, and work more hours. And the mean competitive rate is 50% compared to the 23% for the control group. Due to its effectiveness and the positive data, Illinois is currently using IPS with other populations, the juvenile justice system, veterans, temporary aid to needy families, beneficiaries, those with substance use disorders, chronic medical conditions, and others. Currently, IPS stakeholders are in conversations with our child welfare system to provide IPS services to over the 21,000 who are currently in care. In fact, 70% of the successful Department of Rehabilitation closures or outcomes of 90 days or more for the entire state of Illinois are from those using IPS. It is clear to me and the Illinois lawmakers that IPS is superior and should be the provider's choice when it comes to employment for people with disability. Illinois is not the only state to see IPS as superior. As of 2021, there are 25 states and 6 countries, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Montreal, and Canada, who are part of the international IPS learning community. In 2020, about 21,000 people were served by IPS specialists. This model is well defined by 8 principles and 25-item fidelity scale. The 8 principles are 0 exclusion, rapid job search, systematic job development, preferences, benefits counseling, ongoing retention support, integration, competitive employment, and we will briefly discuss each one.
Okay. Yes. So Ishan, gave us an introduction to the 8 principles, and we want to spend time on them because these are really kind of the foundation for IPS, and they can serve as a nice guidebook for how to provide the services. And so I just, invite you all, if you want, while we talk through them, think about how your agency is incorporating these principles. If you are, and if you're not, maybe what can you do to better incorporate them? So to start with 0 exclusion, this principle is centered on the idea that anyone can work and therefore anyone can participate in IPS services. Really, the only criteria for participation is wanting to participate and wanting to work. I like talking about this principle because I think it's one of those that when you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, of course, we want to include everyone, but it can be tough in practice sometimes, especially with young adults. If you think about, for example, you have a young person who maybe is actively using substances, or they're struggling with housing instability, or they can't even make it to their appointments with you, right? How are they going to make it to a job? And if you think about that, do you hesitate, or does it cross your mind that, maybe they would need to get clean before looking for a job, or there might be jobs that are less appropriate for them? And if you have those thoughts, that's okay. I've had them too. And this principle just asks us to kind of put aside any preconceptions we have about who can work and who's appropriate for work, and just know that work is the thing, especially for young people, that kind of drives them to want to get their mental health or want to get their substance use kind of in check, right? We sometimes think it goes the other way, but it doesn't. All right, second principle is rapid job search. So this one means you just get down to the business of helping people get a job pretty much as soon as they enter the program. So I understand, I've worked in community mental health agencies. You have assessments and intakes and treatment planning and goal setting that you have to do. This one just says, do what you got to do, but also start job searching ASAP. And I think of this one as sort of a sister principle to 0 exclusion, because it forces us to not let anything get in the way of job search. We got to do it. We got to do it for everyone. We got to do it immediately. One of the things we preach about with young adults is the critical nature of relationship building. And I've thought about, how do you balance relationship building and really spending time getting to know a young person with rapid job search? and whether or not those can be done concurrently. I think that they can. I think it requires a lot of intentionality and creativity on the part of providers. But ultimately, you can use job search as an opportunity to build the relationship and getting to know them, asking lots of questions, finding out what they like and don't like, things like that. If you have ever driven a client around in a car, you know that's like golden opportunity for conversation, right? That awkward time when they can't really escape. I mean that lovingly. But then you can use that to ask questions. You use that job search time to build a relationship. So do them together and get creative. Third principle is job preferences drive services. This is the idea that we are working with individuals and they have their own preferences, they have their own hopes and dreams, and we use all of those things to be thoughtful about the services we're providing to them and the jobs that we're looking. So we are not getting every person that we serve a job at the same place because we have good connections there. To me, this principle is even more critical when you're working with young adults, because a lot of young adults aren't quite sure what their preferences are, right? Maybe they've never worked or thought about working. Maybe they haven't been exposed to different kinds of jobs. Maybe they don't know how to articulate their preferences. Whatever the case, part of the role of an IPS worker with young adults is to be super curious and help them figure these things out, help them figure out what kind of career they desire to have. This one, again, we're going to talk about creativity a lot because that is like when you're working with young adults, you got to be creative. And this is no different. Sometimes job options are not plentiful, right? Maybe you're in a rural area, maybe your young person doesn't have transportation, so they have to work kind of nearby. You can still incorporate job preferences as long as you're creative. So a quick example, say you have a client who wants to be an astronaut. And maybe your gut reaction to that is, ooh, okay, what else is on your mind? There may be reasons why they can't be an astronaut right in that moment, but ask questions about what appeals to them about being an astronaut. Maybe they're curious about space. Maybe they want a job that gives them like a bit of an adrenaline rush or something that people look up to or makes them feel accomplished. Ultimately, and kind of the point of that is to say, get answers to questions about what needs they have for a job, and then find jobs that meet those needs. And then also use, job failures, I put that in quote, as an opportunity to learn more about preferences. Like young people, especially, they're going to quit, they're going to get fired, and that can help us learn about their preferences. And I'll pass it back to Ishan to talk about some more.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. And I'll be focusing on benefits counseling. So the number one reason why people with disability don't want to work is because they fear losing their benefits. That's why it's extremely important that each client gets benefits counseling. The moment that the client express interest when they get a job, and even after they began working the job, or they decide to work more hours or switch jobs or get a pay increase, they need to know how work would impact their benefits. It's also important that we educate their parents, the caregivers, and other team members, including the residential staff, the therapists, and even the psychiatrists. We need to be on the same page, ensuring that we are relating the same information. One wrong information can stop one client from pursuing work or lead another one with the overpayment and owing Social Security. The truth is that it is always better to work and receive benefits than just to receive benefits alone. It's simple math. One makes more money in the long run, and the Social Security work incentives are in place to ensure that. For example, the earned income exclusion, it deducts the first $65 and it only takes $1 for every $2. So if you have a young person that's bringing home $1,000 a month from a part-time job, and right now the going rate for Social Security is $794. Once the deductions are made, that young person can bring $1,300 home a month versus that $794 he or she would bring home. And if that young person is a student, and is under 24 years old, that young person can make up to $7,100 before any deductions are made. There are also other programs such as the PASS program and the impairment work-related expense that allow people to deduct certain expenses, and it won't be included in their income. It is important that everyone is aware of these incentives. Once that is expected to know everything, then they can make an informed decision about if they want to work or not. But there's also other benefits that we have to think about when we're working with young people, because education is just as important as work. When they're thinking about post-second education, we want to talk about financial aid. We want to talk about private institutes versus public universities. We want them to look at other options, such as instead of a 4-year university, we want them to look at, maybe a 6-month trade program or certificate program. We want to make sure that all of our clients have all the information so they can make the right decision for themselves. Follow along supports. This is extremely important. You can do all of the work to get the young person prepared and they get the job. The hard work takes place once they get the job. Follow along supports are needed in order to help the client be successful on the job. Meeting with the supervisor on a regular basis, reporting their income to Social Security, learning coping skills, identifying stressors at work, even requesting accommodations are just some of the ways that an IPS specialist provides supports to clients after they get a job. But with youth and young adults, this could look differently, and it requires just a little bit more support. Keep in mind, young people probably never had a job before, and they really don't know a whole lot. So it's important that we take nothing for granted and we always ask the young person if they need our support. Travel training, talking about appropriate work attire, understanding pay periods, and even the difference between net and gross pay and how taxes play a part are always topics that comes up in the first 30 days. Those first 30 days are the most critical when it comes to a young person working a competitive job. I remember a young person quit his job because he thought the employer was going to fire him. I spoke to the employer and she was caught off guard because she thought he was doing a really good job. She just couldn't believe it. Sometimes picking up your phone after hours can stop a client from losing his job or preventing a client from doing something that he shouldn't do. In my experience, the more accessible you are to that client after they get the job and how often you check in with their supervisor, the greater chance that young person has of keeping their job and being successful. Principle number 6. Integration. Integration is probably one of my favorite ones. I talk about this all the time. Out of all of the principles, I feel like if integration is done right, it can really make an impact on your outcome. It's important that the agency create a culture where everyone is talking about work in school. Imagine a young person who's in your residential program. They go on to work or school, and then they're meeting with their case manager or their therapist, and they're talking to them about, what happened at work, or they're working more hours, or even when they meet with the psychiatrist on a monthly basis, and the psychiatrist is checking in with them and seeing how work is going. That is how it's supposed to look. That is true integration. If there's true integration, it minimizes conflicts and mishaps, such as reporting income, scheduling conflicts between work and school, or other important employments, such as a court appearance. It coordinates services to avoid any conflicts. It collaborates and discusses individual clients and their employment goals. We're making a shared decision. It's not just clinical staff or the employment staff making a decision, everyone coming together to make those decisions. Also, it gives the opportunity to advocate and help the team think about employment for people who haven't been referred yet. Get them to look at things differently. And more importantly, the IPS, because some of them are not trained in clinical interventions, they have the opportunity to learn from their teammates and be able to address some of those clinical matters.
Okay, so number 7, competitive employment. Such an important principle. We want people who have psychiatric disabilities or serious mental health conditions getting paid at least a minimum wage. However, for older youth and young adults with serious mental health needs, they may benefit from some non-competitive employment, vocational, educational types of internships that are going to help them to build confidence and competence in work or work-like settings that they might not have developed because of disruptions related to serious mental health needs, perhaps maybe going in and out of residential or psychiatric hospitalization. These really do disrupt vocational development, and it is really important that we help connect young people to opportunities to build crucial basic job skills and also opportunities to learn what they like and not like. And I don't want to steal people's thunder, we're going to get there. But at the end of the day, it's all about exploration and figuring out like what feels good and what might I think about a career in. So all this like early vocational development can really get disrupted with young people who have very serious mental health conditions. And it's important that employment specialists and education specialists work with the clinical teams to create opportunities for young people to get these pre-vocational experiences so they can be successful with competitive employment in the future. And job development. This is my favorite principle, hands down. I kind of feel bad about that, but it's taught me so much about developing relationships with employers. And I will say this, I do think that supported employment education specialists are deeply disrupting stigma, public stigma, because they're working directly with employers and helping them to understand that young people with serious mental health needs can work and can be in school and be very, very successful. I love the 3 cups of tea. And so if you don't know what that is, look that up. It's such a great, just simple practice for doing job development. However, as an IPS specialist, you might need to apply the 3 cups of tea with all sorts of other, I'm going to say, institutions, education settings, maybe the local Y. You might end up really doing what I call community development. So it's not just cultivating jobs and having a lot of job contacts. It's figuring out, okay, how do I connect a young person to things that they need that's going to help them eventually be successful with work and or school? And it's all about career. You're going to hear me say that as much as I can today. Okay, so get ready for the ugliest slide of today, but it's meant to be ugly because it has lots of information that later you can click on and go explore some stuff. So almost a decade ago, blah, so gross to think about, Thresholds partnered with UMass and WestStat to enhance IPS by adding supported education and near-age vocational peer mentoring and what we call the TIP model. And we'll get to that in just a second, but the transition to independence process model. And we ended up developing, we have a couple of papers that are published and a webinar that I just wanted to throw out there to you guys for a future reference to go check out. But what was interesting about IPS with this specific population, because it was youth and residential who had long-term histories of institutionalization, and we had some pretty good outcomes, but I thought it would be important to mention the study that ended up informing ended up informing the young adult IPS fidelity scale. So after this study, almost a decade ago, UMass then took what we had learned and then studied doing IPS, supported employment, and supported education together with high school students. And that then produced actually the IPS manual. So if you later would like to go check out the young adult IPS manual and fidelity scale. And additionally, I did want to throw out that in Texas, we worked with 5 providers and then ended up more closely working with 3 to really understand some of the barriers and facilitators of doing IPS well. And I want to point you guys in the direction of this, I think, very accessible journal article to learn a little more about how to do strong supported education while doing supported employment. And then finally, I need to mention there is a large growing literature of the effectiveness of supported employment and supported education in first episode psychosis services specifically. I want to point out a couple of studies here, and you can look at these later, but the most effective IPS services, so supported employment and supported education services, were when an additional module was added. So a workforce fundamentals module. And we've definitely seen this on the ground at Thresholds, that our young people need a lot of coaching on the basics of navigating a workplace. And we call this cultural capital, like really learning like how I need to act and what I need to say and what I need to ask on the job. And a lot of young people that struggle with IPS don't necessarily, we make assumptions they know what they're doing and know how to navigate a workplace. Can they have their phone out all the time? Usually not, right? And we might need to, as an IPS specialist, say, hey, actually, you need to maybe ask about where your smartphone can be. Can you have it on the job? And so this idea of doing a lot of coaching, reinforcing, and role modeling with basic job skills, critical for being successful with IPS with young people. Okay, passing to Flora.
Cool, yes. So out of all of the work that Vanessa talked about, was developed a young adult IPS fidelity scale, and the link is there if you're interested in checking it out. And I'm going to just very quickly talk through some of the enhancements, and we'll get into more detail about some of them later. But one of the things that includes that Vanessa talked about is supported education, and also a focus on career development, which we keep saying over and over. We know that one of the developmental tasks of young adulthood is figuring out who you want to be, right? And developing your identity. And that includes your career identity. So as IPS providers working with young adults, we want to help them explore and develop what type of career they want to have. So it's bigger than just getting them employed and getting them a job. It's actually fostering that process of figuring out what their life is going to look like and what their career is going to look like. Vanessa also talked some about that competitive employment piece, right? That jobs pay at least minimum wage, and I could go on and apply for them. Ishan could go on and apply for them. The young adult enhancement also includes things like internships. And if you think back to your time as an adult and what your kind of early job experiences look like, I bet they included kind of non-typical looking jobs. Maybe you babysat, maybe you mowed some lawns, maybe you had internships and things like that. And I love this enhancement because it allows for those very normal young adult experiences, and while still being faithful to the model, which is, very important. And then there's also assertive engagement. We're going to talk in depth about engagement later, leveraging social media, involving family proactively. Family is a big one, right? Because they are just kind of moving out of their youth where family has been very involved, and that transition can be tricky. So providers, if you've worked with this age group, that it can look a little different than working with younger kids or older adults.
Thank you. I love that you're like, let me highlight what Vanessa just said. So great. Supported education. I just wanted to have a quick moment to just recognize that this originally employment specialists and education specialists were separate. They now are so much more likely to be integrated on multidisciplinary teams that are serving older youth and young adults. And it is really interesting to think about the skill sets that go into how do you do that well. Employers are one thing. There's lots of different types of schools too. Like, how do you learn all that? And I just wanted to like highlight the challenges to this role, but also really the importance of it. So part of the support education role is really increasing access to education programs successfully. And what this includes is actually doing vocational career assessment. And what I'd like to challenge you guys to think about, shifting your approach to assessment and thinking, I know we have an assessment we probably do it at intake and every 6 months. And I want to push you to think about how every day you're assessing. Every day you're learning about yourself, arguably, and you're learning about the young people and your colleagues. And really thinking about as you're working with young people and partnering with them and partnering with your colleagues, you're learning and assessing, and you can apply that to your work very actively. It will also help you to be very nimble because young people like to switch what they're interested in a lot, okay? And being really aware that like, oh my gosh, one day they're really interested in that. I want to train to be a security guard and sign up for that. And the next day they're like, actually, no, I think I want a full-time job at Starbucks. And you're like, what is going on here? And so really to keep up with them, you have to like take a step back and see vocational assessment as like an ongoing thing that happens when you're working to connect young people to education programs. Also, just to reiterate, retention is the most important part. Arguably, same parallel as to employment, helping young people navigate when they start to struggle in courses, and also not to replicate anything. One of the big fundamentals of supported education is do not replicate services that are already at a school. Help connect young people to a tutor. Don't be the tutor, supported education specialist. Fight that urge. Help connect that young person to the tutor. That's reinforcing and learning. Gosh, how do I connect to a tutor? We don't want to create a bunch of young people that are super dependent on their supported education specialists. For a lot of things, they're going to need to know how to navigate in education programs themselves. And finally, again, it's all about focusing and learning through supporting. What is the goal? The goal is not just finish that course or get that job and keep it for your 90-day milestone. No, the goal is to figure out what your career is and to launch careers. So I challenge you, support education and employment specialists that are on this call, to take a step back and really think about every day in your work, how am I really helping this young person learn about who they are and launch their career? Okay, and here's where we get to the most exciting part of today. Here are some of we're going to go relatively quickly through each of these. We all have a couple. What we're going to do, these are the additional enhancements that we use on the ground in our work, and we have many colleagues across the country that use these, and we train on these, and we would like to bring them to you today. And I'm going to shift this over to my colleague, Mark, right there. Let me move over.
Got it. All right. So really cored in on the technology here, just moving a computer.
Great.
Thanks.
Fancy.
So what we're talking about here is that we know a little bit about the enhancements to the IPS fidelity scale. What we really want to get into is what's in between and beyond the fidelity scale that we find to be super important when you're working with youth and young adults around employment and education. And so we know very well the concept of recovery for those with mental health needs and how important and how life-giving the concept of recovery is. What we also know is that if you were to ask some of your young people about what recovery means to them, I don't think you quite get the same sort of answers that you would be expecting. And so when we're thinking about youth and young adults, what we know is that they are in a position where they are most likely to incorporate things into their personality and have the malleability to incorporate things into their personality that they never were able to before because their brains are functioning at a much higher level. Yet at the same time, they also aren't so solidified in their personality where they aren't bringing in new things and kind of learning things about themselves. So we want to think about that shift of philosophy from recovery to the concept of discovery for young adults. And so the concept of discovery is everything that we've been talking about so far, right? The idea that jobs in school are about what are you learning about yourself? What are you discovering about yourself? That if I'm a young person, I may start to learn that by working in a setting with a lot of other people, I really struggle with my anxiety in that sort of setting, and I can't do that sort of thing. Whereas another young person may feel like I really need to be around a lot of other people and a lot of conversation because the more movement I have, the more I'm being distracted by some of those internal thoughts that really get me down. So that concept of discovery and learning about yourself is so endemic to the work that we're doing around school and work. It also really kind of lends itself to the concept of moving from treatment goals and a treatment philosophy to career goals. And I think Vanessa said that quite a bit. And, career development in work and school is, as Ishan would put it, everyone's business, right? And so we want to be thinking about that shift over and really kind of taking ownership of a discovery-oriented approach. Okay, so this is where the transition independence process comes in. And so for those of you that are on this webinar, you can put in the chat if you've had some exposure to the TIP model already. And so what we have found is that building in a philosophy of work around IPS really dovetails well with young adult engagement strategies. And if you look up the best kind of practices around young adult engagement strategies, they're all going to sort of center back to the transition independence process, or what we call the TIP model. And so the TIP model has a number of principles that we'll talk about in a quick minute, and then also a set of practices that you can use with your young people to really help engage young people in their goal-directed activities, in really being able to build in that discovery-oriented approach to really balance that riskiness that is just sort of a part of being a young adult with what they're learning from going through risky situations, and how to balance that as both a practitioner, sometimes as a parent, and allow our young people to have some of that riskiness, but also be able to provide that support. It's about in vivo teaching and learning while doing, and how that's such a big part of discovery-oriented approaches. And really how to involve family and family-like folks as a young person is working on some of their goals. I love these transitions, don't you? Some of my favorites. So a couple of the principles here that I'll just name that really balance well with IPS is engaging young people through self-discovery and rapport building. So as you build that relationship, you're able to engage, and it's those casual hangout opportunities where you get to know what interests a young person, what gets them going, what sparks them, what motivates them. And then you take that into guideline 2 around tailoring your services and supports, so that as you learn from a young person what kind of job interests might they have, then we start to match that up and tailor our services to that. Very much what we're talking about in IPS, right? The idea here is that we're also at the same time balancing out allowing personal choice and responsibility with our young people, taking some responsibility, having that riskiness take place, but then that safety net of support so that our young people can learn and discover about themselves. You know, if you have a young person that ghosts a particular employer and then gets fired, what is it that they learned about that? And what are they building as a result? Also, as you're going through this process, what is a young person learning about themselves that is just kind of a strength or an interest or spark or something that makes them unique? And how can we be there as a sounding board for them to get to know that and get to learn that about it, and then provide more and more opportunities to build upon it? And so that comes very much in job opportunities, volunteer work, in school-based atmospheres. 6 is all about kind of maintaining that outcome focus. So what is a young person getting out of this particular goal? What are those things that may be straight from the goal? Or maybe if a young person isn't doing so well now, what is it that they were doing really well a couple months ago, and how can we circle back to that? So really kind of thinking about how young people are doing, keeping track of that over time. And then also building our community around really thinking about how to enhance the services for young adults. And that means a couple things. That means working with young folks in who they consider family and bringing them into the fold. How can they support a young person in work and school endeavors? And then also kind of thinking about how you can bring in peer and peer-like folks and give our young people leadership opportunities. So when they've had situations that they've dealt with, they can come back and talk to other young people about, like, oh yeah, let me tell you about my first job. Or, man, I thought I was doing really well at school and then this happened. Whew, let me tell you about that. So really kind of enhancing our young people's voice and kind of building community around these sorts of things. So the idea that like these TIP model principles dovetail so well with what we're talking about in our IPS enhancements for young adults. How is that?
That's great.
Okay, great. I'm passing it along now.
That's Laura.
All right,
Yes.
Laura, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to be quick, but this is kind of my soapbox issue here, identifying staff who actually enjoy working with young people. It sounds so obvious, but so many times it's left out of job descriptions or it's not asked about in job interviews. And listen, young people, young adults, teenagers are not for everyone. Trust me, like I get it. They're difficult. They can be really annoying. They can be mean. They can be hard to engage. We love them, but we acknowledge, right, the challenges that come along with them. And so what we're saying here is make sure, be intentional. If you're a person who's hiring people to work with young people, be intentional about finding people who have passion for this age group and who have characteristics that kind of work against some of those challenges. So people who are patient, who are flexible, maybe they're go-getters, like they want to be in the community knocking on doors. They don't take things personally. I remember the first time I got called the B word by a client, right? It hurt. But you know, you learn when you work with young people that you cannot take things. So just highly, highly encourage that you think through, that you're intentional in your hiring, and that you make sure you're including things that get at this in your job postings as well as your interviews.
Oh,
This
let
is
me
me
take
again.
this.
I was prepared for a break. No break. That's totally fine.
Nice
So-
try, nice try.
This is another soapbox issue for me, that assertive engagement that we talked about earlier. Mark made the comment about ghosting, right? Ghosting in young adults goes hand in hand. We expect it. It's not always personal. I won't say it's never personal. Sometimes they just don't like you, but usually it's not personal. You just have to be very assertive and very tailored in the way that you engage young people. We've talked about, you know, their preferences change, right? Maybe you confirmed a 3 p.m. appointment at noon, and then you knock on the door and they're asleep or they're not at home, right? These are the things that happened. You know, Ishan's laughing because she knows, she's been there. It can be really frustrating. We're not saying don't get frustrated, but we're saying come to expect it. It is completely normal. It goes along with everything we know about young adult development, about all that executive functioning that they're still in the process of getting. And so just be really aggressive out there, be targeted, be in the community where the client or the young person is, and be thoughtful about what motivates them. Don't give up either until they verbally say, I do not want to work with you anymore. Do not leave them alone. And then even after they've said that, like go back a month later. I bet you they've changed their minds. And if they haven't changed their minds, they'll tell you. You don't have to worry. And then just on an administrator level, if you're a program administrator on this webinar today, think about your program policies and whether or not they support this kind of outreach to young people. You know, maybe what do your discharge and no-show policies look like? Do you have hard and fast rules about it? Or is there flexibility for the provider to be able to engage in assertive outreach? What does re-enrollment look like? Because we know young people, like they leave and then they want to come back. And do we make coming back really hard? Because we won't get them back if it's hard, if they have to go back through intake, if they have to work with, you know, new people, if they have to go into the clinic to do all the paperwork again. So just some things to think about how your agency is or isn't facilitating this type of outreach.
Right. And, you know, to Laura's point, a lot of organizations that run IPS with young adults also will be thinking about like some of those principles that come with the TIB model that really have to do with how do you go about like doing that strategic engagement around their motivators and how important that is. So it's just a great way to sort of dovetail that in. And so, you know, organizations that are doing a lot of that young adult work will bring in some of those young adult engagement practices, kind of like TIB model and so forth, for exactly those purposes. So I love what you were just talking about there.
All right, E.
Yeah, various, depending on many factors, including where your client lives or funding for IPS, it's going to be important that your team, including leadership, work through some of those barriers. There was one question in the box about which is a typical barrier that a client don't want to disclose or don't want to work with you. That's okay if the client doesn't. It is their choice. They will come around. I remember working with one client he did not want our help at all. So he got a job, kept the job for 2 weeks. He got fired. He's able to get a job. He got another job. You know, this time he kept the job for a month. And then the last time he got a job and they fired him after 3 days. And I remember him coming to me and says, Ishan, why is it that I can't keep a job? And I looked at the young man, I said, that's a good question. Let's start talking about that. And we sat down and we realized that he was not addressing those mental health needs. He was not meeting with his therapist or seeing the psychiatrist. They will come around eventually. There are other barriers that comes up with families and teachers. You may have teachers that they only want to focus on education and they don't want the young person to work. Or you may have a family member, you may have one parent that say, I want the young person to work and not go to school because they can help pay for the bills. Or another parent that says, I don't want them to work because I'm afraid of losing my Social Security. It is this, going back to what Mark said, it is important that with the TIP model, that we allow the client to choose what they want to do. And so we teach them to advocate. And we also need to educate our parents and the teachers around this. Rural job markets. There are a ton of barriers when you're looking for jobs in rural areas, such as transportation. It's hard to find a job, especially when young people don't have cars and they rely on transportation, and there isn't any transportation, or there's minimum. The buses run every 2 to 3 hours or on certain days. How do you overcome those barriers? Or if you have a young person that didn't do really well with one employer, it's not like Chicago, they screw up at Walgreens. I can go to a Walgreens a mile away. But in a rural area, word spreads really quickly, and that young person, they hear about what your agency did, and nobody wants to work with you. So it's important that the team sits down and strategically think about how they're going to address those transportation issues. You know, are you going to do carpooling? You know, are you going, as Laura mentioned, are you going to look for jobs where they can walk? You know, they can walk to and from. I remember one agency, because of the transportation issue, they actually purchased vans for their clients. That's not always an option for companies, but you want to make sure that you guys sit down and address those issues. Substance use and justice involvement. When I was an employment specialist years ago, we have come a long way with Ban the Box. There was a recent bill in Illinois, and other states have passed this bill, where it's making it easier for people with justice background to get jobs. You also have employers that are understanding that our clients, especially young people, marijuana use is what they're doing on a regular basis. They are they're seeing marijuana use as like alcohol. So when they're doing a drug screening, they're excluding it. Amazon just came out and made that announcement as well. So even with those successes that we've had so far with substance use and justice, there's still things that we want to make sure that we address with that young person. And that could be, you know, whether you're going to use motivational interviewing, whether your agency decides to take the harm reduction approach, or maybe you're going to look for employers that's only going to hire, that will hire, you know, felons or people with justice involvement. Maybe you want to get involved and look for how do you, you know, complete sealments and expungements. There's so many options to overcome these barriers. Another thing that comes up with employment specialists is billing. Especially if they're not funded privately and they depend on Medicaid. One, we have to teach the employment specialists to how to focus on medical necessity when it comes to working with that young person. But more importantly, you know, their targets will look differently. It is impossible for an IPS specialist to have the same target as a clinical, someone who's working clinical, because they wouldn't have time to job develop or look for schools and things like that. So it's important that your agency look at that and see how can we make those adjustments so they can have times. So these are just some of the barriers that comes up when working with this.
So I wanted to mention strategic integration or increasing collaboration between clinical staff and the supported employment and education staff, because young people, as we said earlier, are changing their minds. They have a lot going on. It's the time in life where there's the most instability. And so in order to really support young people with career development, you have to, as a supported education and employment specialist, you have to be in strong communication with your clinical folks. I don't mean just a once a week meeting. I mean, when you learn something about the young person, you're passing that information on and vice versa. So critical given the amount of instability and just what all the stuff that's going on in young people's lives. They're also with multidisciplinary teams, including coordinated specialty care for recent onset of psychosis. There are hierarchies, there are power differentials. And what we need is for career development in work and school to be just as important as clinical outcomes, as wellness-related outcomes, because we know the research tells us, for adults, and also I believe now we have more research telling us that for young adults, that work and education success then produces those clinical outcomes, right? So we want to see employment and education as just as important as clinical care and clinical outcomes. And then finally, having strong role delineation. This is challenging, but critical that you, as a supported employment education specialist, if you're working on a multidisciplinary team, your team, so help each other out, but also recognize that you first and foremost are in the role of supported employment and education specialist, and that should be the perspective and approach that you're bringing to the team. They're multidisciplinary teams for a reason, and so working closely with your supervisor and your program administration to keep those roles separate if you can. I know there's issues with funding. We may need to braid funding. You might be a part case manager, part supported employment and education specialist. We see that all the time. It's totally okay. But recognizing for this model to work, it's about specialization. It's about putting that work in school first, and that's the specialty that's brought to the team. And finally, I just want to put a shout out there of the importance of having people with lived and living experience. If you have the opportunity and you have peers at your organization, or if you're fortunate enough to be on a team that has a peer provider or a peer mentor, partner with these young people or these people who are in these peer roles. They can provide a level of support that we know really matters for work and school and also for general well-being. Also, find ways to connect young people who are doing great with IPS and supported education with those who are struggling and who could use a little motivation and a little validation. And finally, use yourself. You have gone to school, you've had a job, you've been a young adult. Use those experiences to validate how hard it is to navigate work and school as a young person, and we will leave you with that. We're really a community. We're excited to have spent this time with you guys today, and we're in this together to really put career development first. And Ishan, do you want to say a couple things?
Yes, and I'll be quick. So historically, it's been the case that vocational interventions are often overlooked when it comes to working with people with mental health conditions, especially those with psychosis. Over the last few decades, we now know that vocational interventions are just as important as clinical interventions, especially for youth and young adults. Young people want to be normal, go to school, work, hang out with their friends. They don't want to be seen as different or something is wrong. And going to school and working makes them feel that they're normal. That's exactly how I felt when I was that age and going through my own struggles. I was broken and in a dark place in a long time. I remember when my siblings and I was meeting with the psychiatrist for the very first time, and he came out and said to my grandmother, he looked at her and he pointed at me and he said, "That's the one you should be worried about." That was the first of many people reminding me that something was wrong with me. And it wasn't until my mentor showing me something different and me focusing on education that I knew that I was going to be okay. My twin brother was the opposite. Work gave him meaning and purpose. He spent so much time working. It was a distraction for him. In fact, he was working in Springfield when he died at the age of 22. 4 months later, after his death, I walked across the stage and accepted his diploma on his behalf. And 3 years later, I walked across that same stage and got my master's degree. It was a proud moment for me. I always say, education and employment is what kept me alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishan, for sharing. That was fantastic. I know we don't have time for questions. I don't know if Jennifer wants to close us out.
Wow, I want to say thank you, Ishan. Those are really powerful words, and I tell you, it stopped me in my tracks there. I was just about ready to pull up these slides, and you just drove that home beautifully. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Sean, Laura, Mark. That was great information, and we really, truly appreciate having you here today. Just outstanding. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. I got a chance to peek at our participants, and I'll tell you what, we had some awesome people in the audience, And I appreciate the comments that we've had throughout the session. Just a quick reminder that I will put these presentation slides and we'll get those links. There are a number of links that you all talked about. Folks are really interested in those. So we'll be sure to get that to you all. It'll be on our website. I'll email you and remind you when all that is up to be viewed. So know that it will be available. Also, I will be getting CEUs out to you all to give us a pocket of about 2 weeks. It'll probably be sooner than that, but we'll keep you informed of when that's ready to be retrieved. I have a slide up for you all to see right now. So get excited. Know that these awesome presenters will be returning for a more intensive training that will be on July 29th and July 30th. Please, please, please register, get excited about that. I am actually going to put that link right here in the chat right now for you all as well. So here it's coming your way. We hope to see you there, which is going to be awesome. Lastly, we do have a survey. If you don't mind taking a brief moment to complete this survey just in regards to the training that you saw today. There'll be another brief survey as well that will be kind of tacked on with that as well to give us the input regarding some training opportunities and whatnot. So please, please, please take a minute to do that. You can use this QR code here that you see now. And then when I end the webinar, it will also pop up on your screen to take that as well. So with that, I honor your time. Actually, I can't believe that it's already 1 o'clock. That went by so fast. It was a great training. So thank you all for your time today. You're wonderful. Thank you to our presenters, and we'll look forward then to seeing you at their presentation then again in July. All right, take good care. Be well. Have a great weekend.